you're out there. I can feel you now. I know that you're afraid. You're afraid of us. You're afraid of change. I don't know the future. I didn't come here to tell you how this is going to end. I came to tell you how it's going to begin. I'm going to hang up this phone, and then I'm going to show these people what you don't want them to see. A world where anything is possible. Where we go from there is a choice I leave to you. Folks, this is something I was going to do earlier. This is going to be on the Monahan scissors. I had promised to do this like last week, but I'm getting to it this week. So we're going to start with the charts from the original charts. This comes from the original Moynihan report, the unemployment versus welfare, and this is the scissors. This is where the divergence of non-white or black male unemployment went down, while new welfare cases from non-white women went up. And what Monahan said that it kind of disturbed him, because he's from the Department of Labor and he's trying to figure out how he can actually, number one, help the black family or employ black men, but also bring welfare down, bring out of wedlock births, divorces, abandonment, as they put it, down, in a black family down, right? By giving black men jobs. It was actually predicated on doing this. Bringing black male unemployment down, but also bringing this down. And when it didn't happen according to the old rules, he was confused. Now, it's kind of hard to see it this way because of the way it was drawn. But if you see the next slide, this one. See this one, this slide here, it actually gives you a better picture. Like if you can actually see black or non-white male unemployment will actually be in sync with the welfare cases. Not quite as in sync as well, but you can actually see it. This is from 1948, right after World War II. In fact, what Monahan was saying is that black male unemployment went up. It also tracked welfare cases. What he couldn't understand was this: the divergence. He saw the divergence in what? We actually see the divergence start in 1961-62, right? You can clearly see the crossover in 1963. What he couldn't understand is why. And that's where we're going to start. We're going to get into why this divergence happened. Because on the surface, it doesn't make sense. You have years and years and years of this happening where they align, and all of a sudden you get to here and it diverges. Crossover point. That means something happened right in this area within these couple of years. There's a reason why these two things diverge. Why this went up and this went down. Doesn't make sense, right? So we're going to actually investigate why that is. Actually, an extension of what we're talking about. This is something that was actually dug up by Art of Idmore. And actually, this is on Wikipedia. This is already readily available. Anybody can actually look this up. And this actually goes along with the same time period that we just looked at as far as Monahan scissors, right? And what I'm going to read after this comes from a book about child support. The lady actually helped Bill Clinton reform child support in 1996. And she goes through a whole history of it. Part of the book actually goes through what happened in this time period. Talking about AFDC. The program was created under the name Aid to the Dependent Children, ADC, by the Social Security Act of 1935. As part of the New Deal, it was created as a means-tested entitlement which subsidized the income of families where fathers were deceased, absent, or unable to work. It provided a direct payment of $18 a month per child for one child, $12 a month for a second child. In 1964, the average payment was about $420 a month. Sounds about right. Actually, a lot of money for 1994, $420 a month. Okay. The federal government required the contributions from individual states and authorized state discretion to determine who received aid. In that amount, ADC was primarily created for white single mothers who were expected not to work. Black mothers who had always been in the labor force were not considered as eligible to receive benefit. In 1961, a change in the law permitted states to extend benefits to families where the father was unemployed, a measure which 25 states eventually adopted. The words families with were added to the name in 1962, partly due to the concern that the program's rules discouraged marriage. Yeah, that was partly because there's a lot of states that had the man in the house rule. Most states did. The civil rights movement and efforts of the National Welfare Rights Organization in the 1960s expanded the scope of welfare entitlements to include black women. See that? In 1961, the change, civil rights. In the 1960s, it basically expanded it to black women. The welfare rolls, racial demographics changed drastically. Look at that, folks. Can't make that shit up. The majority of welfare recipients still remain white, and most black female recipients continue to work. Starting in 1962, the Department of Health and Human Services allowed state-specific exemptions as long as the change was in the spirit of AFDC in order to allow some experimentation. By 1996, spending was $24 billion a year when adjusted for inflation. The highest spending was in 1976, which exceeded 1996 spending by about 8%. You actually look at the graph. Look at that graph. In 1967, the federal government began requiring states to establish the paternity of children eligible for the program and extended benefits to unemployed male parents with a work history. So even though they allowed it, the man in the house rule was still in effect. You know, the letter of the law and the spirit of the law are two different things. But look at Monahan's scissors. That's what we're talking about. Starting in 1962, 1961, 1962. Go back to the chart with Monahan's scissors. That's when you saw the change. That's when the racial demographics changed drastically. Okay, because they were discriminating against black women. And when they stopped, guess what black women did? Did they go stay with their husbands? No. What did they do? They left. That's what they're trying to say. They left. They bombed their marriages. Like Kevin says, they wrecked their own homes. That's like a Monahan said there's something going on with the black family because they're not reacting the same way that others have reacted. In other words, you give them welfare instead of a supplement what their husband doesn't have. They do the opposite. They're taught to be independent of their husband, independent of their man. And that's exactly what they did. That is part of the culture. Peep game, y'all. Anyway, continuing. Coming from the book on child support by Ruth Gilly Kruger. Ruth Gilly Kruger. This is in connection to what we're talking about, the welfare program and the Moynihan scissors. So she talks about the roots of not only child support but also welfare. The Poor Laws, passed in 1597. Parents of children or independent person, it has to maintain a child. But this is the antecedents of what we have now as far as welfare and child support. Okay, like we're saying, and it used to be states and local governments actually responsible for child support. Okay, but right after the Depression, the United States decentralized the structure into state and local governments responsible for child support. The system remained effective until the federal government became involved in providing cash grants for children in 1935. This is after during the Depression. This program, Aid to Dependent Children, evolved into Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, and that name is used throughout this paper. When Aid to Dependent Children program was established, few mothers worked outside the home. They do mean white mothers. You're going to see that later. The program was intended to support families where the husband was dead or disabled. When survivors insurance was added to the Social Security Act in 1939, it was expected that AFDC would gradually wither away. We always know that never happens. Skipping down, gotta remember this is a child support book. So we're going to focus on AFDC. I said the rising divorce rates of the 1960s and 70s were more consistent with long-term historical trends. Cherlin found no definitive reasons why the divorce rate roughly doubled between the early 1960s and the mid-70s. The reasons he cited are increasing economic independence of women, society-wide attitudinal shifts, and possibly the relatively unfavorable labor market position of large numbers of young men from the baby boom generation. So people say that baby boomers had all the jobs. Okay, that's not true. Cherlin also reported that in the 1960s and 70s, a steady upward movement occurred in the age of marriage, along with a sharp increase in the number of unmarried couples living together and an increasing separation of marriage and childbearing. So contrary to popular belief, the rate at which unmarried women bear children has gone down for blacks and increased modestly for whites, except teenagers, since 1970. But the proportions of births occurring out of wedlock has increased for two reasons. The rate of childbearing has declined even faster for married women than for unmarried ones. It is more socially acceptable now for a single woman to bear a child without marrying the father. The technological changes in fertility actually boosted this kind of idea to come in, and mostly actually projected by the women. It wasn't really the men. People always blame it on the men. It was mostly the women first. Okay, the feminist movement heralded the movement of women into the labor force and erosion of gender-based division of labor at home and work. The rising educational level of women made them more competitive in the labor market. Furstenberg reviews the feminist and fatherhood literature and finds evidence of the declining involvement of men in families during the period from 1960 to 1980. This declining involvement led to weak parental attachment to children. With women in the workforce, more single-parent families, and an unfavorable labor market for young men in society was struggling to find ways to care for its children. All of these factors influenced the development of the child support policy. And remember, this is a child support book. Here's another one. Tradition and states' rights kept the primary focus of child support at the state level, but federal government exhibited a steady growing interest in child support for children on AFDC. They wanted to get them off. Here's a good one. Congress considered civil penalties for desertion and non-support in 1947, but no legislation made it out of the judiciary. They didn't want to go after white men. Okay, in 1949, Tom Snead introduced H.R. 4057 designed to prevent the federal program for aid to dependent children from abuse by able-bodied parents who abandon their children. Such abuses have increased so rapidly in recent years that they are becoming a national curse and threatening this entire program. In other words, even back then, very difficult to get AFDC without what? Without what? Proving that the father either abandoned the family, couldn't be found, or what? They were dead. Remember, AFDC is designed for what? Women who have whose husbands have either died or are disabled. Skipping down. In the 1930s, most children needed AFDC because of the death of their father. The majority of the growth was due to the composition of the caseload, and desertion and lack of marriage gradually become the primary reasons for families going AFDC. In other words, it changed. In 1951, illegitimacy was the cause of dependency in only 11% of the cases. By 1956, This is just 5 years. It doubled to 22.7%. And it wasn't just black women, because black women couldn't really get it back then. This is white women. So it's not just us. To some extent, this change in proportion results from the fact that more widowed mothers with children under 18 are receiving less under public assistance or none at all, as they are qualifying for survivor benefits under old age and survivors insurance program because its coverage has been substantially extended beginning in 1951. Partially, the Age of Dependent Children program has thus shifted in emphasis from one design primarily to aid widowed mothers and their children to one design in which family problems are the cause of broken homes, desertion, and illegitimacy. In other words, they started allowing for illegitimacy, for out of wedlock. In city after city, a new problem is causing a growing concern to budget-worried officials. This is the problem of financing the care of the sharply rising number of illegitimate children. This is largely a big city problem that has grown with migration of the Negroes from north to south, from south to north. The District of Columbia officials now are seeking to strengthen a law which empowers them to bring fathers of illegitimate children into court to make them pay for the children's support. So they've always done that. States have considered reducing or withholding relief payments to unwed mothers of more than one or two children, have been warned that under federal law they cannot deny assistance to children because of their circumstances of their birth. Okay? In other words, this was forced by the federal government. Senator Bridges, Republican New York, stunned by what he termed a severe criticism in March 1960 Red Book magazine, defended his request for a report on the illegitimacy racket in the welfare program. In his defense, he cited welfare concerns described in a series of featured articles by the Washington Post and the Boston Herald. Bridges also inserted into the record a letter he received from a circuit court judge in Oregon attacking Red Book article for glossing over the errors in the AFDC program and ignoring immorality. Representative Everett inserted a letter from the Director of Public Welfare in his state, putting forth the proposition that all children receiving AFDC shall live in a suitable home. Her definition of a suitable home including a stable moral environment. Having an illegitimate child while receiving assistance was considered a failure to provide a moral environment. Members of the 87th and 88th Congress, 1961 to 1964, became progressively more alarmed by the impact of the increase in illegitimacy on AFDC. Representative Hoffman supported a suggestion from Representative Roos to limit the number of people who could move to cities because women go to some place where they can get additional relief for every additional child they have. A step-by-step succession of children and all go on public relief. In other words, women were using it as a scheme. Senator Miller inserted an article from the Des Moines Register implying that the growth in AFDC in the District of Columbia was due to the fact that the city's population had been changing from white to Negro and to loose family ties. In other words, the men weren't abandoning the families, and women were actually moving to a city where they can get more support. The Memphis paper was extolling the work of a judge in Obion County who required mothers of illegitimate children to identify the father and swear out a warrant for his arrest. Those who refused were denied welfare benefits. A married woman seeking assistance because of the absence of her husband had to swear out a warrant for his arrest before being considered for assistance. If he was found, he was brought back for trial and frequently sentenced to 1 to 5 years in prison. Sounds a lot like what they're doing today, right? This stuff is not new. AFDC problems taken from the Detroit News in the Record. That article identified the problems arising from the lack of self-discipline on the part of some recipients. Not enough work and not enough work skills. The article identified the long-range solutions: education, training, child care, and fair employment practices for Negroes. So sounds like a lot like what Bill Clinton did in 1996. A lot of this stuff is not new. If you look back you can find a lot of what we passed had a historical antecedent, sometimes 20, 30, years before. Here's a piece, and something we all know. Some felt that the growth in the AFDC was due to fraud. They believed that a substantial number of fathers were not really absent. Thus, the pre-dawn raids where welfare workers roused women and kids out of bed and searched the house for men. That's where the man in the house rule comes, from. If you look back at Claudine, where the welfare workers comes in unexpected and does the scan, does the search of the house to see if there's anything where there could be a man's present. Here they mention the Monahan report, which you've gone over, about the deterioration of the Negro family is a fundamental source of weakness of the Negro community at the present time. In 1960, 33% of non-white children and 10% of white children under 18 were not living with both parents. Another set of figures stated that 13.6% of non-white married women and 4.1% of white married women were separated from their husbands in 1960. That ratio is still pretty much the same. It hasn't really, 4-to-1. In 1963, 3% of white births and 24% of non-white births were illegitimate. Non-white is a code word for what? Black. Here's the key. There were also perceived racial inequities in the welfare system. In 1966, the Georgia Act was challenged on equal protection due to process grounds in Anderson versus Sheffer. The complaint alleged that in practice, the policy has the intended effect of depriving a large number of Negro families of AFDC benefits and maintaining an available supply of Negro laborers for agricultural employment in Georgia. County boards in rural areas terminate AFDC eligibility for Negro mothers as of a certain date each year, regardless of whether employment was actually available. White mothers are usually exempted from the work obligation because farm labor traditionally is not suitable for them. Remember, we're saying that white women were considered homemakers, and that was their job, and black women were not eligible because they were considered part of the workforce, and they had to change that in 1961. Some of the thought. This is part of that case. This is part of the thought that went on back then. In other words, what we're saying is why they made that change is exactly that. Okay, this is something that, this back and forth that they always wanted. It was a bill they tried to pass by the Attorney General, Department of Justice, that in order to receive AFDC welfare, applicants were required to do what? Assigned to the United States all support. In other words, whatever money you get, it has to go back to them. Which had accrued in a time such assessment was executed, which accrued while on assistance. That's where they went to the TANF, where guys had to pay all their money back. That's how come you have a lot of guys paying back child support to the state. To cooperate in establishing paternity of the child born out of wedlock, obtaining support payments or other resources due for herself and her children. Okay, the problem, aid to the families with dependent children. AFDC offers welfare families which the father is dead, absent, disabled, or at the state options unemployed. Okay, the caseload size has risen from just under 450,000 families in 1948 to more than 3 million families today, representing a cost increase of over, I think you said 6 million, but I think she meant $6 billion. It is in those families which the father is absent from the home that the most substantial growth has occurred. Of course, that they were saying in Moynihan scissors. In 1967, 3.5 million persons were receiving AFDC because the father was absent from the home by the end of 1971. Just 4 years later, that figure had grown to 8.1 million. Thus, in just 4 years, families with absent fathers contributed more than 4.5 million additional recipients to the AFDC rolls. In 1971, AFDC study by the HEW showed that 86.6% of absent fathers, the AFDC recipients contribute no support whatsoever to the family. In nearly 25% of the cases, the father was not married to the mother. The study also showed that in more than 44% of the absent father cases, this father's whereabouts were known. In fact, in 24% of the cases, the deserting person was found to be residing in the same county as his dependents. In other words, they knew where they were. They didn't abandon them. Women knew where they were. Skipping down. And this is coming from the League of Women Voters, right? We believe that desertion is a symptom. Hear that, CMPG? Not a cause of family disintegration. I would say that's very true. That's what Monahan was saying. That our primary mission should be to strengthen family life in every way in order to prevent desertion or prevent men from getting kicked out of the house. Finally, we believe children's rights and needs are best protected and American family life is best preserved by strengthening the entire social fabric around the family so they can be healthy. Moynihan was saying the same thing. Why they wanted more jobs for men. They were trying to solve this problem. I think I have one more outline. If not, we'll close this out. I think that's it. In other words, she's basically saying the same thing that Monahan said, but the Kerner Commission said, is that number one, that black mothers were not, before 1961, black mothers were considered part of the workforce. They could not get the same kind of welfare that white women could get. And as soon as they did, guess what they did? Phew, they bounced. What Monahan was saying, what Monahan was trying to say, that the welfare is white women were saying. The welfare was not the real reason of the breakup of the family. There was other factors, and I've been saying that. Okay, black women just took advantage of it. The reason for them not wanting to be with their men was a lot of social problems that was going on inside the family to begin with, and the only reason that they couldn't act upon it because they had no way out. But as soon as they had a way out, guess what they did? They bounced. That's what Monahan's scissors shows you. Them chicks bounced. Like I said, they'll read it again. We believe. These are white women. This is not Moynihan. These are women. We believe that the desertion is a symptom and not a cause of family disintegration. A symptom and not a cause. And it's best to actually fix what's wrong with the family. Preserve what was, fix and preserve the integration of the family by doing certain things. That's what Monahan was trying to say back in 1965. He didn't believe that welfare, he never believed that welfare was a cause. Welfare and desertion was a symptom of something fundamentally going wrong with the internal family. That's how come it happened first with black people, with the black family, because the black family, the integration was weakest, especially when they moved from what? As they say here, move from what? From the south to the north, to the northern cities, to the urban centers. That's when the biggest effect actually happened. Kerner Commission said the exact same thing. This is very consistent. And most people that disagree with this, including the fucking scholars, don't read enough. Plain as the nose on their face. And to this day, and I've heard Adolph Reed say the exact same thing, he felt the Monahan report was racist by liberals that look down on black people instead of looking at the data. After 50 years of data and 50 years of learning that Monahan had saw something, recognized something way back then, we use feelings instead of facts. But anyway, this has been long enough. I just wanted to drop this on Monahan's scissors. Now I got to piece all these little parts together to make it at least listenable. But yeah, it's probably more coming because this stuff is pretty deep. But anyway, with that, I'm gonna jump off here.